Well, good afternoon and welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this Dean's Lecture Series. And this afternoon's guest speaker is Tom Pike, a healthcare industry veteran with over 30 years of experience in global leadership, strategy, and operations, and whose customers have included pharmaceutical companies, providers, and payers. During his time as CEO of Quintiles, from which he retired late last year, he led the healthcare information and technology services companies through a successful public offering and helped to earn it a place on the Fortune 500 and recognition by Ethisphere Institute as one of the world's most ethical companies. Tom has also been recognized for his commitment to developing his employees into leaders who can adapt to change and work effectively in teams. His approach is particularly relevant to us here at Stanford Medicine as we equip people to lead and innovate in an era of increasingly complex healthcare. Not only is Tom an experienced and highly trusted healthcare leader, but the topic of his talk is an especially relevant one for us as we strive to lead the biomedical revolution in precision health. Tom knows firsthand how clinical trials have evolved over the past 3 decades, but drug development has yet to evolve with the rising healthcare challenges and technological opportunities before us. Today, researchers still may be reticent to share their clinical trials results for fear of losing a competitive advantage. And there continue to be silos keeping healthcare systems from sharing patient data or even from helping patients to access their own data. Today, it's still much easier to withdraw money from an ATM machine from my bank account than it is for us to get our lab results. Moreover, our healthcare system revolves around treating disease and not necessarily on fostering health. Most of the interactions that people have with the medical system and with their healthcare data focus on a few points in time, a visit, perhaps in response to an ache or a pain. This reality is sustained by a reimbursement structure in which physicians are compensated primarily providing sick care and not for focusing on health care. To address the most serious healthcare challenges facing the world, we need to rethink how we collect, secure, analyze, and share our data. Fortunately, the technological opportunities surrounding us have never been better, and our potential to predict, prevent, and cure precisely has never been greater. Accomplishing this mission means embracing real-world evidence outside of the clinical trial space. That's the approach that Stanford Medicine is taking with last month's launch of Project Baseline, a joint effort jointly with Verily, Google Life Sciences, and the Duke University School of Medicine. In addition to clinical visits, this 4-year longitudinal study, Baseline, will employ wearables, medical imaging, and surveys to track the health of 5,000 people here in the Bay Area and 5,000 people in Tom's home state of North Carolina. By ingesting inputs from so many different facets of subjects' lives, this initiative will give us a view of health that's more of a feature film than it is a snapshot in time. Our hypothesis is this will enable us to better understand not only what makes people sick, but also what helps keep us healthy. This project and other Stanford Medicine initiatives seek to disrupt the status quo and spark precise translational healthcare advances. Tom is no stranger to disruption, having spent years advising large pharmaceutical companies on how to rethink their research and development processes. That's why I'm eager to hear his take on studies like Project Baseline and the challenges and the changes he sees on the horizon for the development of bench-to-bedside solutions for human health and well-being. Please join me in welcoming Tom Pike. Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A nice introduction. I I really appreciate being here, and it's interesting even hearing some of the exciting activities that are taking place here, especially around real-world evidence and things that are so close to our heart. I'm here with my colleague Adrian McKinsey, and he's going to help answer questions. But I have a little warm-up presentation that we can go through just to talk a little bit about some of the subjects that the Dean was talking about there. And I've titled this Clinical Research 2020 because this is a little bit about the past, but it's really where we see clinical research going over the next number of years. And there's no clear paths for it, but you can start to see the outline of what's coming. Just a little bit of a disclaimer. I have to admit, I'm a business person at a medical school talking about clinical research, and I realize there's some risk in that. There are people who've been in this industry longer than I have, but it has given me a bit of a unique perspective. This is actually all in Korean if you can't read it. Having the opportunity to meet with leaders all over the world, talk about clinical research, how it's conducted. Quintiles, where I worked for the last 5 years, is in over 100 countries, has worked with 97 of the top 100 drugs in the clinical research process or commercialization process. We had 1,000 medical doctors and 1,000 PhDs, and so it's a very significant enterprise in terms of innovation and drug development. And it gave us a broad footprint. But again, that disclaimer, this is a CEO talking to a medical school. So now, I always like to start these talks and talk a little bit about the burden of disease. And if you look today, we've made tremendous progress. It's easy to pull all the statistics about the progress we've made in terms of life expectancy over the last 100 years in particular. But at the same time, we still have significant problems. I mean, if you look at some of the statistics around Alzheimer's, for instance, it could be 28 million baby boomers are going to get Alzheimer's. It could consume by 2040 as much as 25% of Medicare spending today. More globally, every minute a child contracts malaria. Rare diseases are still underdiagnosed and significant problems. And we don't have enough cures. Even if you look at something like colorectal cancer, even though at this time we've made so much progress, as a percentage, it's actually up in terms of premature death. As a percentage of premature death causes, it's actually up in the last 5 years. So we've got a lot of work to do. This is actually a picture. I really do like to focus on patients. This is a picture largely of my mother. So my mother here on the left, here's the older with my cousins. She had kind of a tough early life, but unfortunately, one of my main motivators for being in this profession is that she had a tough time at the end of her life when she had a stroke in her early 60s with undiagnosed heart disease, and then actually died of colon cancer just a few years later when she hadn't gone through screening. And I think, we think about her every day, and it's somebody whose life's cut short because we still have a lot of work to do. Now, I think you'll all recognize this picture. On the other hand, we believe at Quintiles, and I believe we're in an unprecedented time in terms of the potential therapies. I mean, some of the things that we're talking about, some of the things that we're doing are just incredible. Whether it's using CRISPR-Cas9 technology to actually edit the genome, we're just at the earliest stages of what that's going to mean to medicine. Whether it's the immunotherapies, we were talking today with some of your team about some of the work that's going on here in terms of immunotherapies. Just incredible. We're at the very early stages of potentially curing cancer with the immunotherapies. I know you guys have some of the leaders in the world in this. Regenerative medicine, 3D printing. I was with an executive the other day who is using 3D printing and stem cells to create an artificial trachea. And they feel like they're getting close to having the scaffolding, the stem cells in the right place that they can actually do their first in human. I mean, it's just an incredible time. And so At the same time, we've got this burden of disease. Our understanding of molecular medicine, genetics, et cetera, has never given us more promise. Now, let's talk a little bit about clinical trials. And so what you'll notice about this presentation is I like to have pictures of people, because I like to be reminded that people actually, our industry is a people industry. We drive the innovation. This is not computers. I mean, this is a people-driven industry. And so I like to have pictures of people. The clinical trial, many people think of James Lind, who actually did the scurvy trials in the 1700s for ships crossing the Atlantic, as the first clinical trial. But we have a tendency at Quintiles to think about the more modern clinical trial as the sort of foundational trial. And these would be the ones done in the 1940s, the streptomycin trials around tuberculosis. And these trials were done, there was a fellow by the name of Austin Bradford Hill, who was an epidemiologist and statistician out of the UK, who really created a lot of the methods that we still use today to think about placebo control, which actually happened a little bit earlier, double-blinded, which had just started to really happen in the 1940s, and importantly, the randomized clinical trial. So the modern methods of clinical trials were largely invented around streptomycin. This is very important in a way, because tuberculosis was actually is also an example of why you need clinical trials. Because those of you who study medical history would know that Robert Koch, who was this great microbiologist, is one of the first folks to really use the microscope to discover causes of disease like cholera. He actually discovered the bacterium that caused tuberculosis, thought he had a cure, didn't do it in a clinical trial, and really almost destroyed his own career because they started treating patients with something that didn't work. And so tuberculosis is kind of interesting that would be the situation that would bring us to clinical trial. Now, these two people are the other reason why I put these two folks up. I think, do you guys know who these folks are? Yeah, some. So the fellow on the left is Sir William Halsted. We were actually talking about Johns Hopkins before. Really esteemed surgeon from Johns Hopkins in the mid-1800s. And he was really a pioneer surgeon. He also was the pioneer of the radical mastectomy for breast cancer. And the Halsted method became known as the method. And even going up to the 1970s, it was really the preferred method. Now, no clinical trial had ever been done on the Halsted method of radical mastectomy versus other methods. You may know that what it was removing the breast, also the lymph nodes, the muscles in the chest. It was truly radical and truly disfiguring. And Dr. Bernard Fisher is actually the person who said, we must do clinical trials on this. Even though it's an accepted method of practice, there's a lot of belief in the surgical community, we must do it. And of course, famously now, and I think Dr. Fisher just passed away a couple of years ago, famously, they did the trial in the 1970s, and of course it proved that lumpectomies and chemotherapy were actually in fact superior to the radical mastectomy, and fundamentally changed the practice of medicine and saved hundreds of thousands of women from being disfigured. And I have to say, as a guy who's in the business, people talk now, we were talking about an earlier meeting, you have even technologists from out here saying, we don't even need clinical trials. We understand these drugs so well, and patients aren't getting medicines fast enough. Having been a guy who's seen this in action, we need clinical trials to prove that drugs are safe and they work. Now, clinical research is an amazing discipline. If you're not familiar with it, there's over 5,000 compounds in the clinical pipelines around the world. And this number may be 10, we were talking about it, maybe 10 or 20% short at this point, but over 5,000 compounds that are being developed across therapeutic areas. It's a $100 billion market. And that probably doesn't take into account China and perhaps other elements of Asia. It's $100 billion that is spent on clinical research. CROs, the companies that I was with, they collect about 25 billion of that. Investigators, so physician investigators and suppliers probably collect another 25 billion of that. And then you get the other, which is largely spent within the pharmaceutical firms and a few other places. But if you look at it, this is a very significant enterprise. And interestingly, and I'll come back to this, I think providers and hospitals are underrepresented in terms of their share of this $100 billion, considering the role you play in society. Now, it's a global enterprise. For instance, Quintiles operates, and most of the CROs operate in over 100 countries. We had offices in over 65. And so it's a global enterprise. Usually less than 30% of the subjects in a clinical trial are in the United States. Typically it is global, although it has been changing with some of the products, the fast path products and some of the products over the last few years. We've been doing more in the US, sometimes because of the availability of equipment and methods, but it's a true global enterprise. US is the leading innovator. Some numbers will tell you that as much as 60% or more of the compounds actually come out of the United States. We're the most vibrant in terms of a biotech community. It's here, San Francisco, Boston, San Diego, a few other cities. Our city, Raleigh, is also, in the top 10, probably top 5 for that. But we are the innovator. There's a few other hubs you'll see in parts of Europe, but there aren't too many. We are the driver of innovation. Pharmaceutical firms' valuations, a very important thing happened over the last 5 years, that there was something called the patent cliff around 2012, and this is when a lot of the blockbuster drugs were coming off patent and the prices were coming down. The pharmaceutical values, the pharmaceutical firms dropped during that period of time. But over the last few years, there's been quite a number of approvals. And what the analysts are doing is they're valuing those pipelines, not unlike an oil company gets valued for its reserves. They value that pipeline. And so the pharmaceutical firms have tended to spend more over the last number of years. Biotech spending within the last couple of years was at a record high, although it's fallen off a little bit in the past year. But it was at a record high that was a multiple of previous years. So there is a lot of funding of these thousands of compounds. An entire industry is developed, from CROs to site management organizations, providers. The trials themselves are getting very complex. We're collecting a lot of endpoints. We have about 57% more procedures now than we did just a few years ago, maybe double the number of endpoints, and they're more complex. I talked about more approvals, but all of this really says that I think over the next few years, you're going to see more, not less, clinical research. This is an exciting time. We have new medications. You've got a lot of money behind it. You've got approvals. We'll talk about some other things in just a minute, but you're going to see continued energy in this area. Now, many of you I don't think you can be in this industry without talking about the cost of drugs and how difficult it is to develop them. And so this chart is a chart that since the 1950s, I guess in this case, but primarily people talk about it from the 1980s, that it's become more and more costly to develop a drug. Organizations like Tufts Center for Strategic Drug Development tend to think it's maybe $1.5 billion, $2.5 billion cost of developing a drug. The pharmaceutical firms will tell you it's less than that, but on average, it's very significant in terms of what it costs to develop a drug. And what you can see on this chart is that there's a number of factors behind this. Certainly some of it is the regulatory tightening that's taken place as we've had issues like thalidomide that I was just talking to the dean about a few minutes ago, and then some of the other situations that we've had. So there's been some regulatory tightening, but there's been quite a number of other things too. If you look at it, as more Me Too drugs were developed, it takes there's a very small incremental difference between those drugs. and you need a larger population of subjects so that you can demonstrate the statistical significance. You have factors like that. We were talking a little bit earlier that in many of the drugs that have been developed, the molecular medicine is outstanding in terms of our understanding of it. But until it's in a human, we don't really understand it as well as some of the medications that we had that were developed in more of an animal model years ago. And so again, you end up with larger trials. I think we've all found it interesting as you get into things like biosimilars, that biosimilars have issues of bioequivalency, and those issues cause them to have larger trials than you would expect, even though it's a biologically similar drug. And so quite a number of factors, but the reality is we collect more data, regulations are tighter, drugs are more complicated, and it's a big issue in terms of productivity and then the cost of drugs. Now, we're talking about clinical trials here quite a bit, and so this is actually Austin Bradford Hill. This is the guy who's the father of the modern clinical trial, and the reason why I have his picture up here is because he also not only was the father of the modern clinical trial, but he also said that this approach to clinical trials, this double-blind, randomized clinical trial, cannot be the only way that we can prove that drugs are safe and that they work. And so here's the father of clinical trials saying, keep an open mind in terms of how all of this works. We've got a lot of catalysts for change right now. You've seen, even on that prior chart, I forgot to mention what that downward, the E-Rooms law. I should have gone back to that. I have to give you the punchline of this. I apologize. This is when you're filming stuff. It's always filming things and you miss your punchlines. But just to explain what E-Rooms is, you've all heard of Moore's law, especially here in Silicon Valley. The continuously declining cost of processing power. So this is actually the reverse E-Rooms law, it's been known as, where we're having a continuously increasing cost associated with drug development. I apologize for that. You should have given me a cue, Adrian. I know you well enough to know you were thinking that. Catalysts for change. So we have a lot of catalysts to change. Obviously, the cost, which is in the middle of this, is one thing that's driving through the drug pricing and the cost of drugs. You can't pick up the newspaper, without seeing every couple of weeks some issue associated with the cost of drugs. But we have some other things that are changing. Patient advocacy. We're definitely getting driven now to have more patient involvement. And patients, when there is a potential cure, when there is a potential high-impact medication for a patient community, they are now driving the regulators to speed up. And this is a consistent pressure. It's part of some of the thinking in the 21st Century Cures Act, an act that's gone through Congress to try to speed up and make more effective drug development. Patient advocacy is a big factor. Relative impact of some therapies. Again, if you have cancer today and there's the potential of an immunotherapy coming along, it's just not right if you don't have access to that. We're starting to change as these therapies are really starting to be fundamentally better than prior therapies. There's a real compassionate care issue that's different, that is driving us into thinking about this differently. Clinical research is a care option. I was talking about this today with some of the leaders here. There's a changing way of thinking about clinical research now. When clinical research used to feel like we were testing a new medication on a subject, and it felt a little bit more, and it is in fact often called testing. But what's starting to happen is if you have, again, a very significant medication, you have an immunotherapy that seems to work on your indication, then if you're giving a full spectrum of care to patients, you need to be able to give that therapy to your patients to give them the best care. even if it's relatively early in clinical research. And this is an emerging set of thinking. Adrian and I being in the market, you see a lot about this question. Is it the best thing for your patients to be involved with an institution that has clinical trials as a care option? And it's a new way of thinking that we haven't seen before, and it's important because of the quality of some of these drugs that are coming in the pipeline. Real world data, I mean, the project that you're doing here, so important. I mean, at least 60% of doctors' offices, now about 60%, have electronic health records. Institutions have more as a percentage. But this notion that we can start collecting more and more real world data to, again, prove if there's a side effect or prove that a drug is safe in a larger population is giving us new capabilities that we never had before. We're really just learning about them ourselves because this whole act around the electronic health record, it's really this decade that we're starting to realize the power of that data. And so that's giving us an opportunity to change the way we do things in the clinical trial enterprise. And then finally, I'll mention the new FDA director. I would encourage you to read some of his writings from the American Enterprise Institute if you want to get to know him, because he writes on this subject of speeding up clinical trials, trying to figure out ways that we can use more real-world data to prove safety and efficacy. So this is a topic that our new FDA director is going to drive. And if we do get past some of the political challenges and we do see regulatory change in this area, it's likely to change the way we do trials. It could be a fundamental change. Now, if you think about all of this, what's going to happen is, if you look at the data intensity, so to prove that a drug is safe, to prove that it works, to prove that it's better than the standard of care by a meaningful statistical difference, today you have tremendous data intensity up to the point of approval. You know, you may be collecting hundreds of data points. You may be doing it on thousands of patients. The data intensity is great. Very famously, you know, before we were digital truckloads pulling up to the FDA of documents, and now, you know, similar amounts, but they're on a disk. What's happening is the ability, with the changes in the availability of data, to have a very focused clinical trial, but then to continue collecting that information, especially if it's done on a continuous basis, so that you actually are improving your ability to understand if the drug is safe and if it works in a real population of people. You are improving it across comorbidities because you'll understand them better than in a controlled environment. So there's a real potential to shift the work that we do from very intensive up to approval to intensive, but then continuously monitoring over time. And this has the potential to really change the clinical enterprise over the next few years. Now, if you look at the provider role, in some ways, providers, you know, since we're here, medical school, hospital system, I'm going to talk a little bit about the provider role. If in some ways the provider role can be the catalyst for this change. So if you think about it, right now we've got a classic situation where you have players in place who do things the way they've always done them. What we're talking about is if we're going to speed up the clinical trial process, if we're going to have less data points before approval, that means that medical science leadership, understanding what's happening in the clinics, really not just thinking of somebody as a clinical record, but thinking of them as a patient as they're going through the trial, is going to be crucial, because you're going to need new methods of seeing if there are adverse events. You're going to need new methods of seeing if there are side effects. So that medical science leadership could be key to us shortening timeframes and taking down costs with these new medications. Physician skill development and currency. Now, for providers, one of the things that has been a hindrance, the average drug, it's been said, takes as much as 18 months to get fully rolled out. The new medications are coming, or many of the new medications actually require new skills from our physicians, whether it's learning or relearning genetics associated with them, whether it's learning about, medical devices that are part and parcel of the medication itself. There's a lot of learning with many of the new medications, and this enterprise lets us develop those skills. Attracting and retaining patients, I think increasingly one of the big 2020 items is going to be the power of the patient and the patient getting more and more informed of ways of treatment. The Lance Armstrong story is somewhat famous, right? That he went out and really researched and sought the clinical trial that helped him through his issues. And in the same way, you may be seeing that kind of energy around understanding the treatment options broadly instead of on a one-off basis. Clinical research is a care option. We spoke about a little bit that it really is becoming something that institutions are starting to offer and get positive response from patients on. And then finally, we talked about it. There's $100 billion being spent on this. And frankly, for providers, they get a relatively small share considering it's their patients and their docs doing the tests. And so how much of that $100 billion could come to institutions? We have a crisis right now in terms of so many of our hospital systems and their profitability. It could get worse depending on what happens in the political environment. And yet here is a significant pool of money. But for providers, for most of them, the reason why they're not doing more of this today, the reason why they're not as impactful in the clinical development and clinical research enterprise is the way we work. And so it's going to take some change. Scale elements. So what that really means is that you have to centralize some things to be able to do them efficiently. We actually have some metrics. For instance, many institutions, if an investigator doesn't enroll at least 5 patients in a trial, you probably lose money on it. Now, their trials are different, so it can vary, but if you don't get a certain number of patients, you probably lose money on it. If you have a part-time administrator working with you, they are probably much less efficient than an administrator who supports multiple trials. If you don't select the right trials, you probably don't have the commercial outcomes that you're looking for. So there are elements of scale that if you put this together and you have professionals running it, you're more likely to have it be a successful, frankly, both care and commercial enterprise. Independence of physician decisions. I mean, we prided ourselves on independence of physicians in most of the institutions. But here, a physician may have to take a trial that doesn't interest them that much, may be important to others and not them. We're going to have to work together to be able to do this. Acceptance of institutional medical practices. I mean, this is a challenge we've been dealing with for the last decade, and that's having consistent approaches, medical practices across our physicians. And the clinical research enterprise really requires that kind of consistency. Investment in systems. To really do this right, you've got to have systems, electronic data collection. If you want to capture some of that $100 billion, you've got to invest in systems that help you find patients for feasibility studies, that help you effectively do the data collection, that effectively help you in real-world data collection after approval. Those things are investments that many organizations, if things are done one-off, they don't make. And then finally, the organization itself. Sometimes running a clinical enterprise actually conflicts with the organization structures that are within the companies or within the hospitals. And so there's a huge opportunity for providers and academic institutions to play a role and actually fundamentally change research and change the structure. But we have some pretty significant changes that we've got to get through. Now, I will tell you, I'm seeing some organizations paint a new picture. I'm seeing some organizations who have, especially in the middle tier, but you're seeing a couple of the top tier organizations fundamentally change the way they're thinking about running trials and take advantage of scale and have more professional people in the organization. There's one hospital system physician group that has about 6 million patients, a pretty sizable amount, who's moved to a model that really represents this. They just changed their practices. And we're starting to see it happen. And you know, it's one of these lead or be led type things right now. You either lead it or somebody's going to lead it for you. But it's a big opportunity. Now this picture is actually from the Matheny Center. It's a developmentally disabled child who, painted, pulled themselves together, I guess, in a wonderful way to paint a pretty incredible painting, and really had to, stretch to do it, and created this beautiful painting. So I think we can do it too. And then just my final picture, I think if you think about what we've talked about here today, the clinical enterprise has the opportunity, I should say, associated with molecular medicine, genetics, all the omics, the compounds in the pipeline has never been greater for our patients, never been greater for our medical community than it is today. I mean, it's a fundamental period of innovation taking place. Our clinical enterprise is pretty inefficient for that and really can be improved. And to me, the providers really should be in the front of that change, because we can change this a lot more effectively if providers are leading it than other parts of the value chain. Now, it's an important time. And I always end with the patients. I think it's just, the business that we're in, what we did at Quintiles, what Adrian and I did, we always tried to recenter ourselves. This patient is actually my father-in-law, and that's his 50th anniversary he's at. And you'll note that the date on that is 2002. That's just about the time that he was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And I will say, he's a medical success story, because he's lived till 93. He's had a great life. He's, been disciplined. He'll wake up in the middle of the night to make sure he takes his medication. And he's a medical success story because he's got a great provider. And I think, we need to just keep driving so we have these successes as we go forward. So with that, that's my overview. We're happy to take some questions on the evolution. I hope that was useful. Yes, sir.
It seems like one of the issues with academic centers is the costs are so much higher than they are, say, for doctors in private practice. So how do you feel like we can sort of overcome that barrier?
Yeah. I mean, they're costly in some ways, but as you know, they're all cost centers that have their different cost structures. And so I think you're right that if you use the cost structure of the center overall, you'd probably never justify this. But if you can create a cost center, and a revenue center, in fact, that manages the clinical trial enterprise for you, you can, again, I think, impact patient care as well as be successful financially with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes?
Great presentation.
Thank you.
So how would be, let's say, your more important tips in how to make an academic medical center become competitive in order to partner with industry or CROs for improving the level of translational outputs? Let's say, it becomes an excellent center for drug development. Those are the 3 top qualities I see on this center that you, as a CRO, would seek into an academic academic medical center.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start and Adrian can help. I think it does depend a little bit who the academic medical center is, to be perfectly honest with you. It's like so many things in life, it stratifies into different capabilities that different centers have because of the KOLs that you have and the key opinion leaders, and so it does stratify a little bit. But the main thing that you need to have is some level of critical mass and a way to help them with feasibility, and then, to be honest with you, for them to deliver patients. There are statistics that run around the industry that somewhere between 15 and 25% of sites that open up never recruit a patient. And the average site, and again, these statistics vary all over the place, but it gives you an order of magnitude. Many times it costs $60,000 or more to open a site for a study, and you've got 15 to 25%. So I think what they're looking for is partners who have some mass and who are effective.
Yeah, so three more ideas. One is about the idea of specialism. Everything is about segmentation at some point. The academic medical centers will tend to see a high proportion of particularly rare diseases because of the concentration of expertise there. So that's one area where AMCs are going to be differentiated. I think the second one is one of the unfulfilled promises of the EMRs is they've been, I know we're being recorded, but there could have been a better disposition of these systems across hospital systems, because what we find is even within one hospital system there are different instances which it's hard to conform and compare, and so you can't really easily unify them and get a collective big picture. But in a big academic medical center we found that there can be the spirit behind saying, let's not use different instances, let's collapse them, and let's use them as much to characterize the clinical condition as to represent billing codes. So there's a bit more of a progressive attitude to what could be done with the EMRs. I think the third thing that's absolutely fascinating is some of our work in Quintiles has been about, a lot of our work in Quintiles has been about running the clinical trial and collecting the data. But then the other half of things is that the regulator's one barrier, but the payer's the next, and often the more challenging one now. And many of the new therapies we're working on, the regenerative medicine therapies, the immuno-oncology therapies, gene editing therapies, they're fundamentally going to change the entire cost envelope of consequences through a healthcare system. And having a system that has the ability to not just look at the cost of the therapy, but also all of the downstream consequences of avoidance of complications later, I mean, that's another great advantage that some of the larger AMCs have.
That's great. Other questions? Oh, I'm sorry.
How can you get more scale, and also how can you coordinate the EMRs on a standardized way, and how can you also integrate all the wearables you mentioned with all kinds of different platforms, which might give you many more data points to eventually also look for prevention and very specialized medicine, what we try to do here.
Yeah, there's a bunch of elements to that. I think unfortunately, with the systems, it depends a little bit what you've got, and you have to determine whether you'll integrate it into a separate system, or you can use the system that's been put in. But there are a lot of organizations who are developing systems where they can take feeds in from your systems to have that central systems. I actually think the wearables thing is, my own view is, even though there's a lot of experimentation with it, for us to believe that these devices are calibrated in a way that's consistent enough that we can count on them from a regulatory standpoint is going to take a little while. And so while it's great for us to have some experiment with them, and you can see I'm wearing one, I'm a big fan of them, and we've looked at others, we looked at the patch, it's just to make sure that they're really consistent enough is going to take some time. So You know, as a person who's been in and around technology most of my life, there's no question there's hype curves. And the real question is, can you catch it, you know, after it's been proven and then really integrate it at that point? There will be elements. I mean, some of the things for diabetes monitoring are actually very impressive. We were testing some things with Alexa, and actually using Alexa to have an interactive dialogue with a subject about how they're doing, whether they're adhering to the protocol or the medication. So there are some really great things coming, but I think the wearables are going to take a little while to really be inculcated.
And just on that point of the convergence of the various EMR systems, you know, obviously one way is to, you know, figure out how to match between them and make them uniform by taking what's there and trying to join it and conform it. Seeing as we're in Silicon Valley, the iconoclastic idea would be to develop an EMR for which the EDC, the record of or the clinical research activity, is a subset of the EMR, to give it away.
Exactly.
So it's pervasive. And then to make all of the business model around the collection of that and analysis of that conformed subset of that uniform data. Now, yeah, that's a way away, but there's probably many entrepreneurs in the room, and it would work. You just got to find a way to redesign a universal EMR you're prepared to give away, and is better than the current instances.
Fortunately, in the Bay Area, we have a system. Stanford has it, Kaiser has it, Sutter has it, all the same EMR. So you get it in better, bigger scale.
It will help. If it's integrated, if it's consistent, it will help. Any other questions? Yes, sir. You got a microphone coming here.
I think I need it, actually. Good evening.
Yeah, the sound's pretty good in this room, actually. Very good.
So, Quintiles being widespread around the world, have you seen any practices around the world that we can bring to the US to enhance our healthcare system here?
It's a good question. And I said I'd leave all the hard ones to Adrian. Adrian still works with Quintiles. Do you have any I actually have a couple of thoughts, but why don't you go first?
So, you know, countries like Scotland, countries like South Korea, you know, they really do have, we were talking about Sweden earlier, they really do have a very comprehensive, universal map of all of their patients. So that's a good thing. Tends to happen in more sort of socialist, sort of strong government kind of countries. I think, you know, another thing is countries that do have very well, very homogeneous genetic profiles. And so you think about Decode in Iceland. I mean, that's a fantastic thing. We're actually trying to understand how Ireland could do that too. So I think that, you know, best practices seem to be systemization of systems and systemization of genomic profiles across populations. We will learn so much about that, not just for those populations, but how it translates to broader populations.
Yeah, it's a big, complex question, because we were talking earlier in South Korea again, for instance, the government, corporate, academic interaction is terrific. I mean, it's impressive. They've come from mid-teens in terms of clinical trials participation to probably being in the top 7 or so in terms of participation, and they've declared, they've gone through a manufacturing where manufacturing is going down, chemicals going down, shipping's going down, and they've really declared that biotechnology is one of the things that they're going to try to drive. And so from that are coming initiatives that are creating a lot of innovation. You're seeing a little bit of that in Japan as well, with Abe's pronouncements. And then frankly, China is working very hard to stimulate innovation, and with some very impressive results. There are a huge amount of compounds that most of them are not on the radar of the 5,000 we talk about here. They're not on the radar around the world, but they have stimulated a lot of innovation within China in this realm as well. So I do think some of the ways the government, companies, and academics interact are more powerful in other places.
One other thing just around Europe. I mean, Denmark, only second to Sweden, has the highest per capita participation in clinical trials. And one of the reasons, to the Dean's remarks earlier, is the patients own their record. They own their health histories. And so the assumption is that they're going to opt in to be involved with that next step of treatment, even if it is a research program. So I think Denmark overall tends to have many of the properties that we could all learn from.
Also, they have one EMR system.
Have one EMR system, yeah.
Which we use at Stanford.
Ah,
So that's the EMR system that I work in anyway. I'm also a pharmacist, so I also see two angles.
Go ahead.
EMR
Go ahead, Kate.
systems, here it seems they're very expensive. So smaller hospitals aren't able to buy in. And also with the two top EMR systems in the US, they're competitive against each other. Should they not work together?
We also, I do think you're right. I think the Dean and I were talking earlier that the big missed opportunity in this country was creating a interchange standard. So this country may be too big to have a single supplier, maybe not. But what wasn't done was to create a standard, and that's probably the big disappointment that has come out. That being said, we are getting a whole lot of entrepreneurial companies. I just met with a private equity firm in New York that interacts with 85% of the health systems and pulls clinical records from them. There's a company called Trinetics that does something very similar using codes, and you know, Quintiles IMS is really trying to drive for this as well. So I think we are going to see where it's going to be a secondary data source here that's going to drive it. But Singapore is another one. I mean, the countries that do have the single database are advantaged in this.
and just final thing on that, whatever we do learn from even an improved EMR probably won't be enough, because you really want to look at the script data and the claims data in tandem with that. So when you put those three together, you can really begin to get not just scale, but also precision in identifying just the right patients for the trial.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's amazing the difference. You paint this world and you have good longitudinal data on patients, and the world becomes less costly. Patients are cared for better. It's just incredible the difference as you start collecting more and more data. So I think we're just about at time.
Thank you.
So, okay, stop. Thank you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.